I'm probably going to break your age filter on this, but I think, it's the whole shit in, shit out kind of,
Absolutely.
I think, if your data's not good when it goes in, it sure as hell ain't going to be any better by the time it comes out the other end. So I think
just a prettier table on the other side.
Yeah, 100%.
Welcome to Still Loading. This is the podcast where people who work in marketing and e-commerce tell the truth about what it actually takes, the stuff that doesn't make it onto the case study, the LinkedIn post, or the highlight reel. Today's guest is someone I've worked with very, very closely over the last few years. Peter Young, do you mind introducing yourself?
Of course. I've worked with Seller far too long. I'm currently a client partner at Jacala. Something I've done for about the last 18 months. Before that, I spent a bit of time kind of between agencies and kind of in client side. So worked at Farfetch for my sins. I worked at THG where I worked with the lovely Abdu for about 3 years. He was my first hire at THG. So I spent about 3 years as marketing director there. And before that, I was at various roles at WPP. I ran the digital for about 6 years at Mediacom, and then swapped to the other side of the fence. Worked at Wavemaker for about another 3 years, running the content division, which effectively meant kind of launching their influencer proposition, their content and social propositions, and kind of evolving their what they had in place at the time away from kind of SEO, which was kind of the mainstay of what they did. So yeah, a bit varied, but yeah, it's been interesting.
The way we usually start is with the same question. Pete, what was your first click?
Well, I probably didn't enter the way most people did. I'm by trade a programmer, so my first couple of years working were effectively building effectively coding websites. I was the kind of geek behind everything that kind of programmed things. So we're using databases and kind of PHP to kind of build kind of dynamic experiences for clients. Still relatively early days. It's nothing like what people do these days with with the web, but effectively, I spent probably the first 2 years kind of building websites, and one of my clients was JJB, who used to be probably the biggest kind of sports retailer in the UK, no longer with us, sadly. But effectively built their first e-commerce site, and like most sites at the time, there weren't very many people going to it, and they ended up coming to the agency I work for, and were a bit like, well, lovely website, we think it looks fantastic. We think it is fantastic, but there's nobody coming to it. So what can you do? And at the time I was reading about this thing called SEO and this thing called PPC, and we weren't really doing much of either. I just kind of started reading about it and read a little bit more about it, and with a coding background, kind of very easily fell into the kind of SEO side of things. I started playing around with it and thought, actually, this is something I really enjoy doing. And at the time, the business I worked for wasn't quite so keen on search marketing, so kind of ended up going to a company called Time, and they had one of the big network agencies, which I mentioned earlier on in one of the earlier incarnations, were there, and I was kind of, I can beat them, and they let me loose on one of their websites, and kind of just went from there. Just ended up kind of running search for the biggest brand they had at the time, and unfortunately they kind of went bust, and from that moment onwards, kind of knew what I wanted to do. And that kind of started the journey to where I am now.
And you spent 2.5 years as a managing partner at Wavemaker, and that's significant agency leadership sort of early in the career arc, so to speak. And what did running a major agency operations teach you that you couldn't have learned brand side?
I think the importance of scale probably is one of the biggest ones, I think. Probably two things. I think Wavemaker specifically was probably the biggest thing I learned to Wavemaker was putting square pegs in square holes. I think too many people, and I think particularly agencies are bad for doing this. They try and grow by getting people to do more different things. And I think I'm a great believer in kind of, using people to their strengths. And I think one of the big challenges we had while I was there was, we had about 35 people in the kind of team at the time I worked there, all of which were trying to do a little bit of everything. And really kind of, we were getting some really kind of iffy feedback at the time from clients. And I think one of the things we looked at when we kind of completely rethought the structure that we had in place at the time was just how everything worked to kind of benefit the business and allow us to scale without having to kind of hire additional headcount. So I think probably the big learning, I think while I was there was just how to think about scale when you're kind of building out effective teams. And how to kind of use those strengths to kind of, lean into and really kind of maximize out. And it's something that I took with me to THG, probably made during the kind of 15, 16 years running kind of teams in various guises. I've probably made every mistake underneath the sun. But I think it's one of those things you kind of pick up and learn from those mistakes, and you kind of work out what went wrong, and you kind of refine things the next time you do it. But I think that premise of scale really was one that kind of stuck with me probably from MediaCom, but really kind of hit home in terms of, how best to kind of do things once, with that kind of premise of scale in mind.
And speaking of mistakes, do you mind sharing what was the biggest mistake that you've learned from, and you probably feel that you apply those learnings until today?
I won't say it's necessarily a mistake, but probably I think one of the things there was a guy called Peter Cobley, who I used to work with quite a lot back in the day, and he said one thing to me at the time, and I think at the time I was really struggling. I was at an agency in Manchester. I'd kind of built the team up to, it started just me. We're about 4 of us at the time. I was having this discussion. And I was constantly trying to recruit. And one thing he just said to me stuck with me, which was, look after your P&L, and your P&L will look after you. And I think it's something that's stuck with me ever since. I think every team I kind of go to, every kind of proposition I manage, that P&L is incredibly important. It helps you kind of just, focus and structure your argument in such a way, whether that's a story about growth, whether it's something you need in terms of, whether, growth here and now, or whether it's something where you're trying to do a preemptive, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? God, it's gone. But, preemptive strike maybe into new product you've not launched before. I think me and you did enough of that at THG, where we were, where we'd be launching something that, maybe wasn't something there and there at the time, but I think by kind of getting that commercial story to kind of support what you already knew was a strong kind of commercial argument. I think the P&L just really allowed you to kind of shape that, and then really kind of shows, people that ultimately, kind of make the decisions, the CFO, the financial directors, who are, the ones that ultimately kind of, drive where and how and what you recruit. And I think that's something that really kind of stuck with me. And I think something certainly earlier on in my career, I probably didn't take enough, kind of ownership of.
Yeah, speaking of preemptive growth, I think your time at THG was full of that. So we were going through a hyper growth phase and having to recruit for tens of brands that we're about to procure and not sure if they will land or not. And then you had all the different products and teams that were being created at the time. But
well, I think you know as well as I do just on that. I mean, commercials, me and you lived and died by at THG. I mean, the amount of times we had two sides of the same coin that we had to flip by, the new business guys would call it, would call it down to the fact that, the marketing and trading guys weren't doing their job, and we'd be putting it down to the fact that the commercials didn't stack up, in terms of the opportunity those brands had in some cases of going in. So I think it's something I think commercials really, any kind of business leader going into this space needs to put kind of front and center, because I think you get that bit right, particularly leadership level, everything else you can make fall into place.
Yeah. And I think what made that challenge significantly bigger was this was all during COVID. Everyone was working remotely. So we're speaking to and working with teams that we've probably never really met in the past, and trying to scale up the marketing function, but everyone's again working remotely. So the biggest challenge, I suppose, was building that sort of team culture and that quality assurance and risk mitigation. How did you sort of manage to maintain the standards and direction, the culture of the team that was scaling so quickly? To
a certain extent, I think it's about getting the foundations in place early. I think, one of the things I did right at the start was very much kind of hire good people to sit underneath me, and then build the teams around those guys. I think that's always a kind of good part. I brought you in very early on I had a couple of other good people in at the time. One of your previous guests, Bess Norton, was obviously in charge of content. I think the areas that struggled to kind of really grow and scale were often the ones where maybe those leadership structures weren't in place. And it just meant that, your growth was more fragmented. And it was more, I guess, it was harder to kind of really get that kind of engagement that you found quite easily where you had those kind of strong leaders in place. So I think I would start with that. And I think just make sure, the other thing I'd say to people is don't try and spread yourself too thin. I think, what a lot of businesses try to do is certainly I was guilty when I tried to launch my own agency. I think we try to do a bit of web dev, we try to do a bit of PPC, a bit of SEO. And we didn't really get a name for any one of them. So I'd say, I think, if you're starting off something, start off small, scale yourself to what you're good at. And when you've got those economies of scale, when you're able to bring those kind of good people in, then, kind of evolve yourself into kind of other areas, but get the basics right first and then grow from there.
It was a bit of a fascinating time because businesses were jumping on the e-com and D2C bandwagon because retail had shut down completely during COVID. The focus was primarily on just going D2C. And at that same period, you launched TAG-IQ, which is a specialist data measurement sort of team. During that sort of period where not many people were actually talking about data at the time, they were just talking about simply being on D2C. Where did the idea come from and what was the problem statement you were looking to solve at the time?
Well, I think it was more the fact that at the time I felt that the kind of, when people talk data, they talked a nice little dashboard. They could see the results on every single day. And I think the challenge we had was the problems we were facing with brands we were working with were just far more complex than that. We were spending money in mid and upper funnel when we didn't know what impact that was having. We were trying to understand customer journeys, retention rates, that kind of thing. And we had no real data ecosystem or spine to kind of sit off the back of that. So I think the kind of at the forefront of that idea or any of the other product ideas, I think we did together or I did my time at THG, I think we're very much centered off the, some sort of need state. We launched Pixel, which was obviously more aimed at kind of, we had a fantastic studio at THG that produced some amazing, it was amazing space just to host and kind of shoot anything you needed to do. But I think, when you just wanted to do, 100, kind of assets for a meta test that you were looking to run, it wasn't quite set up for that. So I think, kind of, with all of them was a need state, but I think IQ was really just around the fact that I think we needed a more mature, more structured way of approaching kind of consumers kind of data problems they were having at the time. And, IQ was just a fantastic way to kind of just productize that so people could really quickly articulate it, but do it under the guise of a problem solving entity rather than something where you're going in and selling, an individual solution.
And I want to double click into something you mentioned there. So brands trying to maximize their conversion funnel without having much awareness and, not many customers coming through the top and middle of the funnel. Why do brands do that? What is it that makes brands expect a huge amount of conversions and efficiency without the upper funnel investment?
I think in certain cases you can do it. I think there's plenty of examples. I'm a great believer. I think if you've got a market to tap into that isn't necessarily, dominated by a single entity, I think the opportunity is still there to kind of build into existing demand with minimal or limited awareness and consideration budgets. I think to truly scale, that's where brands need that kind of that investment. And I think in certain markets, I work a lot in luxury. I mean, if you start trying to go into that market with without some sort of kind of latent brand awareness or consideration, you are going to spend a lot of time not driving a huge deal of income. So I think, when it comes down to why brands don't do it, I think it's just a commercial argument. It's cheaper. I think most measurement frameworks are set up to measure on a last click or at least a kind of lower funnel orientated measurement framework. And I think by proxy, that's where their money goes. It goes into search, it goes into affiliates, it goes into, those kind of channels where I can put 10 quid in and I can get 100 quid out. And that makes really good sense for the CFO. And, when I've got to stick a kind of more long-term growth framework behind something and I've got to justify why that is, CFOs don't react quite so well when you're like, well, I put 10 quid in and, in 6 months, something might come further down the funnel. They're not quite so happy with those sort of metrics. So I think a lot of it's commercially driven, and I think a lot of marketing teams, dare I say, are not particularly good at making that financial argument in front of their CMOs or the CFOs, and by proxy of that, I think then they struggle to kind of get that investment that they desperately need in many cases through the fund.
It's an interesting one you mentioned that, because in some cases, a lot of these brands would have a big presence in a country and they'll have a large distribution network into retail. And we've seen a number of brands that do this, and there's a willingness to invest heavily into retail marketing, even though it's a lot less measurable and attributable than D2C marketing. But there's still that expectation from D2C to be very performance driven, and their ROAS has to be proven. What do you put that down to?
Education experience. Yeah, I think you remember the early days of kind of COVID as well as I do. I think there are a lot of brands that were, sold millions in stores, hit COVID, had to go online very, very quickly. And then, didn't really have the experience or the understanding of how e-commerce worked, and really, really struggled. And I think there were some big brands that we worked with back in the day. I remember a confectionery business, really well-known confectionery business. You'll see it in Tesco's or Asda every other day. We took up online. They had a personalized chocolate bar that they used to sell online. Actually quite a good product, but the problem was pure economics didn't stack up. They were selling a personalized chocolate bar that people would probably buy as a one-off or maybe once a year for somebody's birthday. And that's the only time they purchased. And when you started doing the economics in terms of what it was going to cost to drive people to the website, what it was going to cost to convert them, when you're selling a £15 chocolate bar, the economics don't stack up unless you can get that person to come back and buy 6, 7, 8, 9 times a year, or buy multiple products, or in some way kind of inflate the kind of, the revenue per purchase that you're able to kind of drive, from that individual, the cost or the lifetime value of the customer. So I think that's where I think a lot of people just didn't really get the dynamics of kind of, e-commerce. And I think, it's a lot simpler to do when you're maybe looking at a retail function where somebody can go in and buy the aforementioned confectionery bar or a lip balm. When they're out buying their groceries, they walk to the till, there's a little lip balm right next to the till. It's a kind of impulse purchase. So people don't really think about it when they're buying it. When they're going to that website to buy that thing, I think that's when those things, need to be more front and center. I think in many cases, I would say your point of education is probably a really big one. I think there's just not enough understanding of how to really kind of make e-commerce work, and then how to, structure everything, your marketing, your trading, your logistics. I think too many people forget about the logistics. And I think that can be a conversion driver in its own right. So I think, it's just getting good people to kind of, that can drive your D2C, that understand it. And to a certain extent, I'd also say just accepting the fact that maybe in some cases, e-commerce isn't for you. I mean, but we mentioned the lip balm business. That was always going to be a bit of a, pushing more uphill kind of a scenario, because they're £5 lip balms. You've got to sell a lot of lip balms to make that one work.
Do you think businesses like that need to stop thinking about D2C and e-commerce, or do they need to rethink their product proposition, or at least the assortment within e-commerce to make it work? Because there's a lot of first-party data they can lose out on by not being there.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head again. I think, kind of how you quantify success, to me is a big one. And I think, look, in some cases, I just think it's a bad idea going e-commerce. I think, sometimes there are just better routes to market than e-commerce. And I think it's always going to be a really, really difficult proposition. If you've got a really low margin product that you've got to try and make work, it's incredibly difficult, because, your acquisition costs are normally higher than the cost of your product. The first party data, can be limited, and your ability to scale that product to be, in any way, shape or form to kind of drive LTV is limited, because even if I take a £5 lip balm, I've got to probably make them in packs of 20, but then I'm reducing the amount that person's then going to come back and buy in the future. There's so many considerations. So I think it probably centers around three things. I think one is definitely thinking about the product. And actually, if you've got something that, I think me and you always used to talk about £100 kind of annual lifetime value was probably about where you wanted to pitch your product and, get it to the point where it was going to be moderately scalable. And I think, having a proposition where you can achieve that in some capacity. So it could be through subscription. It could be through, multi-buys, getting somebody to buy 2 or 3 of a product rather than just one at a time. Having kind of bundles, the trading scene that we used to work with used to create bundles. So I think, there's certainly things like that can be done. I think to a certain extent, we talked in the last question about just, how much money you wanted to spend in brand. I think that the brand piece can't be underestimated. I think your point about first party data, I think is a huge one. These days you're losing more and more kind of, data to kind of, to the likes of kind of Chrome and Safari and, platforms like this, which limits the amount of data we can get. So I think how we can use, kind of these platforms to get that first party data. You don't get them off Amazon. You don't get them if you're in your retail store, but you can get it through your e-commerce store. And that's data you can build, you can use to kind of obviously target against, but you can start building a better understanding of the profile of your customer, what engages with them, use it for a number of other facets. So I think, certainly, I think you've got something that may be struggling to break even. I think that first party data piece, again, can't be underestimated.
It's an interesting point you mentioned there, because as much as there's so many blockers and obstacles in the way of getting clean and good data in the current day and age, e-commerce teams tend to be under a lot of scrutiny and perhaps more scrutiny than any other team in the business. And a good example of that is if a retailer requests a significant investment out of a joint business plan, it's a lot easier to get that approved despite the lack of measurability of it. Than a hefty investment into the D2C. But then when the eyes are on D2C, there is an expectation of everything needs to add up and everything needs to be crystal clear. And if there is any ambiguity in the data, that often creates a big challenge for the e-commerce team from a stakeholder management point of view. And I'm sure a lot of your clients currently go through a similar challenge internally for themselves. How do you equip your clients' e-com and marketing teams to try and mitigate against that, or at least manage their stakeholders?
Yeah, so transparency in terms of, I think, working with the clients, I think very much to kind of make sure we're aligned in terms of, what we're doing, how we're going to do it, and I think more importantly, how we're going to measure things. I think always kind of, I think is a good place to start. I think, we've encouraged, we're often, certainly where I work at the moment, more focused on the kind of performance side of things rather than the kind of above the line. And we often have to work side and side with a kind of more traditional media agency. I think where it's worked well in many cases are the cases where, we've had that transparency with those media agencies. So we know, when they're advertising, when they're going on TV, from the client knowing when they're going to be launching. For example, I work with a cruise brand, kind of knowing when they're going to be launching the ships. We always see a massive spike in the immediate aftermath that they announce a kind of new ship being launched or a new destination they're going to. So having that kind of transparency between all the different partners and not working silo, I think the siloing of anything is always a blocker. And I think it's, for many, many brands, I think particularly those that use agencies, there's often a kind of unwritten rule that says you can't share and you shouldn't work with the other agency. But I think really the ones that work well is where you've got that kind of transparency between the different businesses and you've got everybody working in the same direction. It's allowed us, I think, to just be a little bit more, nimble and agile and just kind of find our place and work well, alongside kind of, with some really defined criteria with brands. And I think, like I said, taking away the silos and taking away those barriers, I think it's just been a big part of kind of driving growth. And I think that it was easier when I worked at places like THG. I was in control of everything. It was, one of the things we tried to encourage a lot there was kind of frictionless kind of work between the different teams. And I think, you were one of the people obviously that had to manifest, a lot of that. So I think the simpler you can make things, the more frictionless you can make things, the better the outcomes are going to be, irrespective of kind of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and then just to bring that to life, the frictionless operating between teams, and you touched on that earlier, is in many senses, what tends to happen is every team from an agency standpoint has their own P&L, and so a client is incentivized or pushed to try and invest more in single channels. And what we try to do at THG is think of the channel ecosystem holistically and put investments where an impact would be made, as opposed to into a specific channel. But since that time, a lot has changed in the industry world with the adoption of AI, and there's big trends in terms of in-housing. Working in the agency side right now, do you see a lot of large customers move away from the agency setup?
Do I see them moving away from the agency setup? Look, no, I wouldn't say any quicker than they were before. There's been a move, I guess, away from going to agencies for a while. I would say. I think a lot of particularly large businesses, I think, have been trying to build their own teams internally for a long while now. I think you only have to look at, Lego is a great example. I think they've, built, the Lego agency. I think it's even called that. So I think you've got a lot of businesses where that started to take place. And I think these days, probably more so than ever, I think it's right for doing that. I think AI is a phenomenal enabler. I mean, I think what it allows you to do, in a very short period of time, far exceeds, I think, what, we could have ever dreamed of doing, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, if we had AI at THG, we would have been laughing. But I think, I think what it's certainly done is, I think it's changed people's expectations of what agencies should deliver. I think both in terms of the kind of the kind of expertise they're able to kind of pass on to the clients, the kind of insights they can grow for clients. I think, the speed at which we should react. I think if you look at the way a lot of the agencies are now set up, I think, a lot of those kind of, operating systems, let's call it the big networks, a lot of them are either set up to kind of make their people more efficient because they can produce something quicker, or they're set up to be more targeted in terms of, allowing people to have better data and better access. So I think that's something that kind of whole data and efficiency thing is what's going to drive whatever happens next moving forward, because I think there's some very clever stuff being done by a lot of the agencies, and obviously that's their focus for in-house businesses. That's not, they're focused on selling a bar of soap or holiday or whatever it might be. So I think whether or not they've got that same laser focus on kind of really driving everything out of a kind of marketing ecosystem, I think that's still to be seen. But I think, look, when I look at even what we can do now, and I've been playing around with Claude Design this morning, and look at building a design system for kind of creative, which is not something, don't be wrong, I've got a passion in creative and how it works for marketing, but, I didn't create banners when I was at THG. That would have been about the last thing I could have possibly done. So I think the premise of having something that can take some of that kind of expertise, away from, or lack of expertise in my case, away from you, and put it into something that's something a little bit more scalable, and something that's going to produce something that's really top quality again and again. Look, I think it's going to be an interesting space to follow. And I think the agency landscape as it stands at the moment, I think in 2 or 3 years could look very, very different. I think big holding companies, I think, have got their work cut out.
It's fascinating because probably up until about 6 months ago, no one would touch AI for brand creative or ecom creative. And then you've got Claude Design, you've got tools like Nano Banana, which are emerging and in some cases doing a really, really good job. But do you feel there's going to be there is still a resistance in terms of using AI for creative? And where can businesses draw the line between using AI, but also the in-house expertise or the agency expertise?
I think it comes down to what you're trying to do at the end of the day. I think, the technology is coming along so quickly. I mean, if you went back certainly 12 months, I wouldn't have used any of these creative tools anywhere. I think, there was still limitations to what they could and couldn't do, and the quality was still quite questionable. I think you look at some of the stuff that's being now, it is very, 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 very clever. And I think the challenge for all of these brands, whether they're looking at it from a data perspective or creative perspective, I think is going to be scale. I think you know it's relatively easy for anybody to pick up a, you know, even if it's a Claude license and be able to manipulate an image, but to build a full system that's interfacing with your kind of, I don't know, your meta accounts and kind of giving you insights as well as outputs. I think, you know, to build something like that, you know, that still needs human thinking, that still needs design to be able to work. That's where agencies are probably going to still hold their own, because I think that's the only thing they're going to be focused on. And I think, you know, when you look at what WPP have built in terms of their operating system, when you look at what, you know, I was reading, I think it was Stagwell last week, when launching some new technology on their front, and you know, I think it's definitely where I think most agencies, I would argue, are probably gearing themselves towards. You know, as to how best to augment technology around what they do and drive it forward. And I think that's going to, you know, as I said before, I think that's going to ultimately determine kind of who and what and where wins. I think, you know, how quickly those people can get to something that's scalable, that's truly kind of impactful on a client's business. And I think that's when we'll start to see the kind of, you know, the sort of the wheat from the chaff.
I suppose, where can brands draw the line? Because on the one hand, you might have AI generated creative and you might have AI generated models within that creative, but then you go into influencer marketing and then you've got actual brand ambassadors and real life influencers working with the brand. Does that not cause any friction from a customer standpoint? Does it create any inconsistency?
Look, if it's managed correctly, I don't think, no, it doesn't. I think ultimately it comes down to, you know, you've got to have somebody that's that brand guardian. And I don't think that's a piece of technology. I think that's always going to be a person, because I think it's something that's not objective. It's quite subjective. I think influencers certainly historically have had that authenticity in terms of, you know, what they say. And I think that trusted perspective of, you know, something being better than maybe it is. Whether or not we've got to a tipping point now, I think I'm not so sure. I think there's still a place for creators. You know, I think that's the way the world's moved. I think, you know, word of mouth's always been important. I think, you know, even back in the day, I mean, God knows how many people used to spend money in testimonials that they put in a newspaper ad back when I was 8 or 9. So I think the word of mouth thing's always been really big. I think, you know, that's changed. That's now people on TikTok or Instagram or whatever it might be kind of talking about a product. But I think, you know, I think if you're going to keep that authenticity, the less curated, tailored that particular kind of messages from that influencer, the more authentic it's going to come across. So I would always kind of just urge brands to be a little bit more considerate of the tone of voice of the influencer that they're working with, rather than the kind of tone of voice of whatever their brand guidelines might be. Just if they're going to get that real kind of authenticity to come through.
Interesting you mentioned TikTok Shop, because I mean, from a background, you've worked at the intersection of performance, brand, data and e-commerce across some really interesting brands. So I'd love to get your honest take on this as far as digital marketing is concerned. It's no longer just D2C at play over here. You've got multiple channels that live outside of the D2C that impact the performance of D2C. So you can have Amazon, for example, whether it's seller or vendor setup. You've got TikTok Shop, and both of those channels operate as a sales channel in their own right, but also a marketing channel for the brand. Does having those channels and the problems that it creates from a last click attribution point of view, does that throw off last click attribution completely?
It certainly throws a little bump in the road, doesn't it? I mean, you and me talked about this endless times in our time together. I think, look, it certainly makes it much, much more difficult. And I think, you know, any connects between those different platforms are always going to be grey, let's just call them that, because, you know, it's very difficult unless you had all three working nicely together to make the direct connection between any activity you're driving. You know, I have the same, you know, a lot of the work I do is in luxury travel, and we have the same instance happen where, you know, we know that for example, 66% of people, I think it is, that the converting OTA have been to the site before they converted. You know, we can see that because obviously to a certain extent we'll get that data back. But you know, it's kind of, it's very difficult to make the kind of direct link, because in some cases there's missing parts of that journey. I think that becomes even more difficult when you put it into the context of an e-commerce client where, there aren't really kind of any data points I'm really going to kind of be able to join together. So I think you have to kind of accept the fact there's going to be some limitations in whatever measurement framework you do. You might have to change, some of your measurement frameworks to really kind of understand what's driving it. But I think just having a more holistic view that can help sometimes, rather than constantly kind of living in the world of silos where it's TikTok Shop, it's Amazon, it's D2C that never meet in the middle. So I think just having a broader view often will help.
You mentioned silos, and I want to double click into that for a moment. Customers no longer think in silos. A customer doesn't sit there and think, yeah, I've now entered my TikTok Shop phase of the customer journey, and I'm going to leave that and then enter the Amazon phase of the journey and then go and hit paid social and then convert. But brands still often have a D2C P&L. You'd have a Amazon P&L and then a TikTok Shop P&L. Each one of those P&Ls individually has to be profitable for the finance director to approve of that channel existing. From a marketing or an e-commerce point of view, there's always the argument that we need to look at this holistically, because those two channels will assist the growth. They might not individually be profitable, but together they will drive long-term profitability. How can you bring that to life? How can you evidence that with the data limitations and the attribution limitations that exist?
I think we've got to change to a certain extent how marketing's seen. I think marketing is often seen as a kind of as an expense, not an investment. I think that word investment, I think, is a very, very important word, because I think in some of these cases, you see proposition or Amazon proposition or even a TikTok Shop propositions taking time to get going, but they'll always be, nearly always, if you're doing the right things, there'll always be a little spark that catches fire, and once it catches fire, I think you'll often see kind of things take off. And I think, really what most brands need is that spark. Ultimately, I think they're all part of one ecosystem. I think the fact that we'll often put, invisible kind of borders around all of our different facets, I think to me is arguably the thing that we need to maybe rethink and recontextualize and rearticulate, because I think often they'll be there for other reasons that aren't just commercial. We talked about D2C and data. That's an incredible, touch point that often people don't measure. I think getting them working side by side, they all function a different purpose. I would go as far as saying, I think if we look 2-3 years in the future, I think, you've already seen social commerce take off immeasurably in the last kind of, year and a half, 2 years. I think it's still going to continue to grow. Personally speaking, I think you only have to look at kind of China and Japan and Korea and how kind of integrated and woven into kind of their ways of working, that whole social commerce piece is. And I think that's the direction of travel I think we're going in. I think that's what we're starting to see already happen in this country. And I think, just making sure that you've got that kind of clear plan and action, so you're not underinvesting in areas like that, making sure that you've got kind of a framework that allows you to invest in those areas, I think is going to be incredibly important. And that needs to be with a kind of, I guess, a horizon that's not 3 months in the future. It's maybe 6 or 12 months in the future, but just allowing you to just have enough time to get that spark going and hopefully get the, then repaying that investment in droves.
And what does this mean for D2Cs and first party data? Will they start playing a much smaller role in decision making for a business? Because when it comes to social commerce, Amazon, you don't have a full view of the customer's journey. So you can operate along the lines of what touch points or what interactions with the customer increase the likelihood of a conversion. You can start making those assumptions and take from there. From a D2C point of view, you've got actual data which you can use to make decisions off the back of it. Are we going to be moving away from first party data, and are we moving away from D2Cs? Is that going to start becoming a increasingly more complicated and costly channel?
See, it depends what sort of horizon you put over this, because I think if you look 18 months in the future, I think you're already starting to see AI commerce and agentic commerce starting to take off. And I think that in itself could be a very, opening up another whole can of worms. But, certainly I think that's where you still maintain some sort of control of the first party data. Travel, for example, we're seeing some phenomenal growth in kind of the use of kind of LLMs as part of the kind of, not just the research process, but increasingly, it's starting to become more of an acquisition vehicle as well. So I think I would answer that question. I think in the immediate future, no. I think it's, I think we've got an 18-month window before I think we really start seeing some major cut through in terms of the role of, D2C as we know it now, but I thought certainly, e-commerce as we know it now. But I think, if we put an 18-month plus, I think that's when the cat gets thrown amongst the pigeons and we start seeing a very different landscape to what we see now. I think, like I said, LLMs, I think will be the place to watch, because I think that fundamentally it will change. It will fundamentally change how we interact, and it will move away from that kind of storefront as we know it and the website as we know it. And I think it'll become more woven into kind of, our everyday life, which I think is a million miles away from where we are at the moment.
Is that going to be the end of brand as we know it? Because a lot of brands focus a huge amount of their time on perfecting the look and feel of the website, and particularly in certain sectors like beauty and cosmetics and wellness and what have you, fashion. When customers start transacting outside of your website through platforms like ChatGPT, etc., in agentic commerce, does that reduce the emphasis on brand? Or does it remove it completely, because brands will have to then focus on discoverability as opposed to look and feel?
I think what's important for a brand might change, because I think at the moment, they'll be thinking about, I have to have Jost 36 font, fonts and all my kind of headings. I need to do whatever it might be. I think that kind of obsession with the kind of look and feel might negate. I don't think it'll ever disappear. But I think, brands probably have to think about their brand in a very different lens, how it's being perceived, how it's being, kind of picked up and understood by people. I think will fundamentally change. But I think the concept of brand itself, I think has always been the kind of defining part of marketing. I think it will continue to be, but it will just maybe look and feel a little bit different as we kind of move into this new world.
When e-commerce started becoming a thing, it was a huge opportunity for startup brands to really grow. And it wasn't really about how much budget you've got. It's actually how quickly you can pivot to customer demands and needs. A lot of what we do today relies on budgets. Have we come to the end of that phase where startup brands can outgrow established brands? Is it more about being able to fund this really heavily expensive, highly tech-driven ecosystem now? And are small brands at a disadvantage again now?
I think the fact that often smaller businesses will be more nimble, more agile, more willing to accept risk, more able to jump on whatever the latest innovation is, be able to react to a certain trend. I think a lot of brands, the jumped on the influencer bandwagon really early on, really kind of, particularly you talked about beauty and nutrition. I think, they really rode off the back of that wave for a number of years. So I think it's just a different way that those small businesses are going to have to think about how they articulate and challenge. But I think, the opportunity will still be there. I think AI and social commerce, I think they're both woefully misunderstood. So I think there's still plenty of room in both of those for kind of small business to really kind of stamp their mark, to get their foothold in those marketplaces, and to really kind of make their own. I think whenever you look at any big kind of sector changing kind of technology coming through, I think you always find there's a winner and a loser. Cameras, when we moved towards digital, it was Kodak that died. Kind of you always find these kind of big kind of winners and losers whenever we move between them. So I think there will be some existing brands that will react well to it. I think there's other ones that will be slow and cumbersome and not make the changes they need to be. And there'll be some new kind of brands that come through and take them all out of the mix. So I think it'll just be one where, I think we can sit back and we can hopefully be part of and enjoy and see what those brands start looking like in kind of 18 months, 32 months time.
If in the early 2000s or the late 1990s, someone said you're going to have brands like Harry's and $1 Shaving Club being the top of the competitors list for a Gillette, I don't think anyone would have believed that statement back then. But then in 2010 onwards, that was a reality. In the realms of social commerce and agentic commerce, what advice would you give startup brands and small brands in terms of finding the gap and the opportunity to really outgrow the established businesses?
I'd probably say again, to a certain extent, what I said in the last one of the answers before. I think try I think to a certain extent, you've got to light a few fires to work out which one's going to take off. I think the way most people scale and scale quickly is, not committing into one area, before they're ready. But I think by the same token, I think, just an acceptance. I think that, what works now might not work in 18 months. That, whatever approach they're taking now, that same kind of willingness to kind of ride by the seat of your pants is probably still going to be in play in kind of 18 months time, I think. So I would say any business looking to kind of get into that agentic commerce world, start simple and scale, and, break everything down into kind of bite-sized chunks. Because if you try and do everything all at once, you're going to fail. So I would just say, keep it simple, keep it agile, and kind of never lose the hunger for kind of just learning something new, because it will continue to change the way we can use imagery, the way we can use data, the way we can use kind of the agentic side of things to kind of just automate things that we're doing. It's going to continue to change. It's changed so much in 18 months. It will be even crazier and wilder in terms of what it'll do in another 18 months. So yeah, just start now, get involved, work out where your sweet spot is and go from there.
I completely agree with that. And I think to a lot of people, it might sound a little bit cliche, but the reality is that's been the formula of success since the inception of D2C and e-commerce. It's not about over-engineering everything. It's actually about, instead of over-engineering and perfecting your data, being able to make good decisions from the data that you have. And then it gets you to a place where you can afford better data and more accurate data. And it's always about that, the mindset of being agile. That made the big difference.
Well, I'll say one thing just on that, because I think, everybody thinks that, every single time something new comes along, that it's brand new, it's never happened before. And don't get me wrong, in many cases, technology is in case, but I think how people approach those new technologies and those new opportunities that come through often is exactly the same as it was when, TV was created in the 1930s, or when the internet came across in the 1990s. The premise of how people take advantage of those opportunities and kind of, sees, how they really kind of grow into those, I think is often, it's tried and tested, and often a lot of it just comes down to, good planning, good execution, and probably above all, just, doing it at the right time. I would say to everybody, that's approaching this, just take a look back in history, because obviously I think there's often little learnings you can take away from what's happened in the past when these things have come along that you can apply moving forward.
100% agree. Really powerful that. So we're going to move to the final 4 questions. They're going to be a little bit more quick fire. And then, so the first one is, you've operated across agency, brand side, luxury, mass markets, UK, US, and so many other different countries around the world. What's the thing that still surprises you about the industry despite everything that you've seen?
Just how naive some people can still be, despite the fact that, we have come so far in the last kind of 10, 15 years. I think given how much data we do have these days and how much understanding of how things work these days we do have, I still find it quite surprising how many businesses still don't do the basics, that still approach things like they did in the 1990s, early 2000s, that don't, test at scale, that don't kind of look, to be scale is a kind of, certainly if you're going into anything web-related scale to me is the word you should be thinking front and center in any of this on. So I would probably say the thing that surprised me the most is just how many people don't think through that lens and don't, particularly when they're at the very early stages of what they're doing. I mean, the one that always lived with me was THG. We ran a test for, I think it was MyProtein that we did it when we created Pixel, and Pixel was just kind of it was a scaled creative solution for clients, and the wins we were just getting off some of the kind of kind of creative that we were able to do. I think just it blew my mind and blew a lot of other people's minds. Just that we were still having to learn that at that point. But I think that'll be the big one to me. I think that comes to the top of my mind now anyway.
What blocks brands from being able to test at scale? There's loads of tools that allow you to scale up CRO and A/B testing. But what is it? Is it a cultural thing? Is it a red tape, internal culture? What's the biggest blocker?
I think often it's probably a bit of everything. But I think normally I think when it comes down to it, it's often a cultural thing. I think often you'll have brand teams that might be very protective of the brand, that think scale is a naughty word. I think it can sometimes be down to the fact of, how people position the solution. I think, people will often position a solution in terms of something technical that can come along, that can save them time and effort. And particularly if you're working any sort of premium or luxury product, that's a word that's going to immediately start ringing some alarm bells. So I think, to me, it's a bit of everything. I think, but I think, to me, it's, particularly as we go into AI. I mean, like I said, I was playing around with some stuff this morning. I mean, the stuff that you can do now without impacting kind of the quality or the output of what you're doing, I think is unbelievable. So I think it's, brands need to start thinking this way. It's the quickest way to learn. It's the most effective way to learn. And you'll get a far better output from it, from that scale than you ever will do just making assumptions and 6 years down the line working what the impact that's going to be is.
It's really powerful that, because there's brand awareness and there's brand perception, and often brands make decisions on what we internally believe the brand needs to look and feel like, and that creates that resistance to testing. Often our definition of what the brand look and feel should be can differ from the customer's expectation. 100%. And if we were just to allow that testing, we can come across, an absolute gold mine from a difference point of view. Moving into your next question, what's something in digital marketing or e-commerce that you think is fundamentally broken and no one is being totally honest about it publicly?
Measurement.
Does good measurement really exist?
No, I don't think it does. I think there's too many gaps all over the place to I say often when I'm talking to clients, I think, a lot of the time when we measure things, it's indicative. It shouldn't be. You should always be able to probe and question that information. I mean, even if you take GA data, often there's 35% of your data that's missing because of consents, because of, privacy around, maybe the browsers that they're using, whatever it might be. So even on what we might have considered 4 or 5 years ago as the kind of holy grail of kind of data as we had it, I think, that doesn't exist anymore. I think, if you start looking at kind of MMM, you could argue, maybe 7, 8 years ago, it was a bit of a Wild West, and, actually some of those data points you could connect. But even that now, I think, it has to be indicative because you're filling in a load of gaps that don't naturally join together. So again, I think you have those. And I think, look, the other thing I would also say is so many solutions these days are people marking their own homework. I mean, if you look at Robin, it's done by Facebook. I know they say it doesn't, sway towards Meta, but why wouldn't it? Google the same, they got Meridian or, I think it's called something else now, but, I think, at the end of the day, I don't think there is a perfect solution out there. And I think you just need the measurement solution that's the best one for you, the one that you feel gives you the best directional, guideline of where you're going, and then work with that. But again, probably as we said in a couple of cases today, just always be mindful that, look, there are good solutions that are coming out. AI, I think, potentially is, can do a better job than some of us can do. So just mindful of what's coming down. But at the moment, and I'd certainly say for the foreseeable future, I think measurement's the one that to me is the most broken and the one we don't talk about enough.
Yeah, agreed. And a lot of times brands will get third-party tools to try and create that single customer view, so to speak. But those tools are only going to be a little bit better than we are at bringing data with lots of gaps in it from all these various platforms and then making a coherent story about it, but it doesn't really perfect the data. It doesn't clean up the lack of clarity or fill the gaps that exist. And I feel that's
I'm probably going to break your age filter on this, but I think, it's the whole shit in, shit out kind of, philosophy. I think, if your data's not good when it goes in, it's sure as hell ain't going to be any better by the time it comes out the other end. So I think
just a prettier table on the other side.
Yeah, 100%.
Agreed. So if we were having this conversation in about 12 months' time, what do you reckon would be different for you and for the industry?
Well, probably a few more grey hairs. No, in all seriousness, look, I think, I put one of my cards on the table earlier on. I think, just seeing the growth, and it's just the part of the iceberg that we can see. I think some of the data I'm starting to see, and I've been a bit of a kind of LLM kind of, not doomsayer, but I've certainly, as much as a lot of people are shouting out and saying, it's just, it's huge and all the rest of it. I've been a little bit more negative on it up till now, but I think, the growth curves we're starting to see, I think, now getting to the point of meaningful. I think I did a bit of analysis in a couple of clients we work on here, and it's now the fourth or fifth biggest channel in terms of certainly traffic driving that we've got. So I think that it's starting to become a meaningful driver in its own right, and that's only the traffic you can see. That's not the traffic that's then hiding away underneath the various other kind of channels within your analytics. So I think when we sit in 12, 18 months, I think that's the bit that I expect, one, in terms of just its impactfulness in terms of driving brands, but I think more so, I think that the whole commerce piece, I think we're going to see really start to take shape. I mean, we're really starting to see it in leisure and hospitality. There's brands already starting to work in that space. I think anybody that's not thinking about that now really should be seriously getting their head checked, because I think it's the thing that I think fundamentally, particularly retail, hospitality, finance. I think finance it will be more and more of a kind of considerable player in a lot of these spaces. So I think it's the one in 18 months. I think me and you will be sitting back in 18 months going, bloody hell, that's changed a lot. And I think it would have significantly changed what we do in 18 months.
And the question we end every episode with, Peter, what is still loading for you?
What is still loading for me? Look, my brain half the time. I think, no, I think in all seriousness, one thing I think I've been really fortunate to do in the last 20 years is work for some phenomenal people. I think, this has been a phenomenal opportunity to come and sit and talk to you for an hour and a half. I think, it's something I think I'd like to do more and more of over the next couple of years. So hopefully this is the first of many.
I mean, we've worked together for how many years, and we've had some amazing conversations over the years, and we've had we've been in the trenches together. So it's always a pleasure to be speaking with you and to work with you. But Peter, that's the perfect place to land. From Wavemaker in Manchester to Harrods and THG to Farfetch and now at Jacala, and the career is still going. That's a career that looks polished from the outside and sounds considerably more complicated from the inside. Thank you for being really honest with me today, Peter. That's exactly what I expect from every guest. Peter, if anyone wants to carry on this conversation with you, where can they find you?
LinkedIn's probably the easiest place. Just do Pete Young. I think it's Pete Young. It's either Pete Young or Peter Young. But that's the best place probably to get hold of me, and probably the easiest.
I'll get the link and we'll add it in the show notes. And we'll be back next week with another conversation, another guest, another first click, and another person figuring it out one step at a time. Still loading, just like the rest of us.
Legend.